Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. We're very happy to have Christopher Blattman here at ITAM. He's going to talk and present his new book, Why We Fight. Well, obviously, he's going to tell you about what the book is. Christopher is a professor at the University of Chicago at the Harris School of Public Policy. Christopher has a very ample and fruitful agenda. He's focused on global conflicts, crime, poverty as well. He's co-leading at the University of Chicago, the Center for Economic and Development, and the fellowship program of the Obama Foundation at the University of Chicago. He has a PhD in economics from Berkeley University, an MPA from Harvard, and before he had a BA in economics from the University of Waterloo. I'm not going to extend on the presentation. I think we can give a better use to our time listening to Christopher's presentation. And then we have Antonella Bandiera, who's professor of political science here at ITAM. Antonella is going to be commenting on Christopher's book, as well as Jakko Merilainen. Jakko is a professor at the economics department here at ITAM. So I pass the word to Christopher, and thanks for being here, Christopher. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Now, can you hear me? Great. So should I talk for a few minutes? Okay. So thank you for having me. So the origin of this book was spending my time at the level of a village in East Africa in the middle of a civil war or an ethnic conflict in West Africa, or studying gang warfare in Medellin, Colombia, and in Chicago, which is my new home city, and realizing that a lot of the lessons I had learned as a PhD student in terms of why we fight, a theory and a literature that was really thinking about international conflicts, had a lot to teach me about what was going on at the village and the gang and the country level, and vice versa, that a lot of the things that I was learning about peace building and countering violence at this micro level was actually, I think, shedding a lot of light on why we fight and how to create peace at the international level. And yet, I felt that these messages and ideas weren't out there. There were 50 years of social science from political scientists, from economists, from psychologists, from sociologists, and a lot of my colleagues knew some of them, but not all of them, and the policymakers and the people out there sort of doing the hard work of building peace weren't aware of them, and that just seemed like a tragedy. So it was like this gift that somebody just needed to wrap up. So this wasn't really a book about my ideas. This was my attempt to synthesize things, basically decades of social science, and bring them to a general audience. And to do it through this lens of different international conflicts and local conflicts. And I guess if I had to sort of explain in brief, how do you give a book in 5 or 10 minutes? Well, the first thing I think I want people to remember if you walk out of this room is that enemies prefer to loathe in peace, okay? We don't pay attention to all the conflicts that don't happen. There's a real selection problem. We're sort of like a doctor who attends to the very ill. Doctors ought to attend to the very ill, right? But what if doctors forgot that most humans are healthy, and that when we get sick, most of us get healthy relatively quickly, all right? And that's the state of the world. You might not notice, right? Because this is a moment where we're consumed in at least 2 major global conflicts, right? You have China engaged in huge military operations off the coast of Taiwan, and then of course you have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So war seems more present and inescapable than ever. But that forgets that 2 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, India accidentally lobbed a cruise missile at Pakistan and common sued. There was an article in the New York Times, if you dug past 40 pages of Ukraine news, and most of us missed it, and I only stumbled upon it by accident. And India and Pakistan have been loathing one another in peace for decades, without it very seldom escalating into serious violence. This is even true of Russia and Ukraine and Russia and its neighbors. For 20 years, Russia tried every means imaginable to co-opt Ukraine without large-scale violence. Propaganda, dark money, assassinations, co-opting separatist movements, on and on and on and on. War was a last resort. And likewise, Russia has managed to co-opt most of its other neighbors, Kazakhstan, Belarus, without invasion, right? Because enemies prefer to loathe in peace. The second thing to remember if you walked out of this room is that this is true because war is ruinous. It's just so costly. Like, look at the cost of this one war. Russia has invaded a relatively small, geopolitically important, but not one, a country that most people, maybe even including myself 6 months ago, would have struggled to find on an unlabeled map. And yet, we have a fuel crisis consuming Europe, gas prices shooting up all over the world, food crisis globally. Half of Ukraine is producing half of its GDP right now. It's spending half of its GDP every month to conduct the war. Russia is probably not going to reach its pre-war level of income per capita for another 10 or 15 years because it's already sank 10% and may or may not be growing, right? Tremendously costly. This is why most enemies seek to avoid warfare, and why most of them do. And the third thing you could remember is that every answer to why we fight is an answer that one side or the other overlooks or ignores these costs, or is for some reason willing to pay them. And the book talks about 5 reasons why, and I won't go into depth, but let me just give you the 5 superficially and how we can understand something like Russia's invasion of Ukraine through that lens. Because it's a case where almost all 5, I think, actually really help us understand what's going on. So why did Putin ignore these horrendous costs of war? Okay, the first reason is that he's unaccountable. He's an unchecked leader, right? For the economists in the audience, there's an agency problem. He doesn't bear all the costs of war. He doesn't have to pay them, he's not accountable for them, and so he could ignore many of those costs of war. And this is a classic problem. And this is true of even some democratic leaders, but it's most true of autocratic leaders. And that's why autocratic leaders have been the most likely to go to war in history, because they don't bear many of those costs. And they may also have a personal private interest that they gain from that war. And what was Putin's personal interest? Well, he's trying to preserve power. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it about the Ukraine invasion that helps preserve his power? And one answer to that is, here is a country that you Russians identify with more than any other place on the planet. And it was a growing, thriving democracy, one that had thrown out 2 more autocratic and Russian-facing leaders in the past 20 years. And that's a dangerous example to have on your doorstep. And if there's an opportunity to extinguish it through threats, or if necessary through invasion, there's part of the private incentive, right? Is that enough to go to war? I don't think so. But does it erode some of the incentives for peace? The fact that he doesn't bear those costs and he has this little private interest? Absolutely. The second, I think that's very important, is what I would think of as ideologies or intangible incentives. And this is the story you hear in the press. You hear about a Putin who is obsessed with national glory, getting the empire back together, of coming back from past humiliations, of a Russian people who also dream of national glory. So that's not a material gain. They're not gaining anything hard or material, but there's this ethereal thing that they get from violence and invasion that they can only get through warfare. And that will run against some of the costs, right? So they recognize the costs, but sometimes leaders, especially autocratic and glory-seeking leaders, are willing to pay those costs. And so again, on its own, probably not enough to lead to invasion. It seldom is. But combined with ignoring some of the costs, being unchecked, having these other private incentives to preserve power. Now we're getting close to the case where war suddenly seems to make sense. Then we get to another story you hear in the press, which I think is also true. I think it's exaggerated, but I think it's also true, which we could call misperceptions, which is that they got it wrong. That that Putin's an insulated, isolated leader who was getting bad information, and he overestimated his chances at victory. All right, and this is surely true. This is true because a lot of our leaders, including democratic leaders, are overconfident in a psychological bias. So this is the charge levied at, say, George W. Bush and his administration and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's also an institutional bias that can happen when leaders are surrounded by yes men and women and they get biased information, especially autocrats. This, I think, underestimates the fourth reason we fight, which is uncertainty. Because you can only get misperceptions if the truth is fundamentally uncertain, right? But you needn't get biased information to still go to war. Just uncertainty on its own is enough to potentially push two rivals into conflict. So think about 6 months ago, how many things were uncertain. How strong and unified the West would be on sanctions. How strong and plucky and effective the Ukrainian military would be. How ineffective and problematic the Russian military would be, at least in the first months of the war. Now, all of these things were possible, but the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three was almost nobody predicted, least of all Vladimir Putin. All right, and so in the fundamental uncertainty, it's possible to essentially misjudge your chances. And essentially, amidst that uncertainty, invasion and war can be a gamble. And it's a gamble he took. Now, the misperceptions might add to that, but we don't want to overestimate misperceptions and forget the role of fundamental uncertainty. And then the fifth and last reason rivals go to war is something political economists call commitment problems. And it boils down to a set of circumstances where neither side can commit to a deal. And so a deal unravels before it begins. And in this case, sometimes you get commitment problems because one rival is expected to rise dramatically in power, and you have an opportunity to invade now and lock in your advantage. And that's one of the primary explanations for the First World War, for the US invasion of Iraq, and for actually most long wars in history. That's probably not what went on here. There's potentially or arguably a different kind of commitment problem, which had to do with the political institutions on either side. By virtue of being an unchecked autocrat, there's almost no peace deal that Vladimir Putin can commit to. And this is one of the fundamental impediments to a deal right now or a pause in the conflict, which is the worry that if the fighting stops and there's a truce, that this is just an opportunity for Putin to regroup and attack again, right? Because there's a commitment problem on his side. Likewise, Ukraine and its political institutions, its democratic institutions, they have difficulty committing to a deal as well, because Putin knows he could make a deal with Zelensky, but Zelensky has no ability to implement that. It has to be ratified by a parliament. There have to be constitutional changes. And then there has to be some belief that an angry public won't vote those people out of office and refuse to implement any peace deal in future. And this essentially describes the failed Minsk Accords and how the prior peace deal was unimplementable in a democracy. Okay, and so neither one of these things on their own is usually enough to ignite a conflict, and it's why conflicts are actually so rare. But you do get these circumstances where they all come together. If we had more time, I'd talk about the second half of the book, which is the paths to peace, and it's what makes some societies successful. And every successful path to peace is rolling back one of those or more of those 5 causes of war, essentially getting each side to focus on those costs and overlook some of these private incentives and overcome some of these strategic incentives from uncertainty and commitment problems. We could also talk maybe in question period if people are like, I think it's a very interesting window to think about the drug wars in Mexico or in the United States. Why do we fight? How do these principles apply why aren't we making deals? And to sort of look at it through this lens. But I want to pause there, and we'll do discussion and questions.
I'm going to do like a non-sponsored pitch of why I think you should buy this book and you should read this book. So if you follow at least like one political scientist and one economist on Twitter, you probably heard that this book offers, and I think Chris described it very well, like a very general framework to analyze the problem of violence. And in his book, he talks about a lot of different forms this violence can take, like interstate wars or civil wars, or even the war on drugs or gang violence. And I think this book is very important because it informs policy and institution building and potential interventions. But the reason why I really enjoy this book, and I think a lot of people should read it, is because it's very ambitious, but it's also very successful at presenting a very big literature. So I think Chris may be one of the most well-read economists, probably because he's also like a political scientist by adoption. But I was blown away because I read a lot of these things in grad school and as an undergrad, but he presents this game theoretic framework that we have thanks to Firon and Powell, but he also combines that with insights from very interesting literature like Elizabeth Wood's work in El Salvador. But he also brings a lot of insights that come from his own work in fields like psychology and sociology. So I really think this is like really amazing. And I think this like strategic and behavioral framework he lays out, and I think we should definitely talk about the second part of the book, it's very useful to understand why like these easy solutions that we are like very tired of hearing about, like this facilist approach to peace don't work. Instead, and this is what I really like about the book, he offers like concrete ways forward. And I think like the most important part of the book is like we have like an influential scholar leaving aside like this moraline and like this, I don't know, like prejudice like approach of like not talking to these organized criminal groups, and he really acknowledges like that peace has like a very dark side, and if we care about like the human tragedy of losing lives every day, we really have to engage with these actors. But I'm going to offer some talking points. So I think the book came out in a moment where we had like this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of the public attention it has received has been like connected to these events, to China and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about Latin America. You've been visiting us more often, so I think you will be also interested in talking a little bit about this. And I'm going to briefly like mention what I think is the role of inequality in your framework, the difference between criminal violence and other types of violence, and like the trade-offs that I think emerge from your book, but also your more scientific papers. So we know like Latin America is a crazy region. It's like very unequal, but also pretty rich. And it concentrates a lot of the violence that we observe around the world. So one of the things that I always think about when I think about this problem is like what's going on when like countries urbanize and become richer, but are very like produce inequality, no? They don't have institutions that produce like the inclusion of all these people that live in cities but don't are like bad serviced by the state. So we know that crime is like very unequally distributed in terms of geography, but also like of the demographic characteristics of the people. And this is this is probably true everywhere, right? Like young males that are poor are more likely to die during conflict. But I think this is a really explosive problem, and I think I want to know more about what you think the role of inequality is, because you talk about poverty, and I think you see it more as a moderator. Like it doesn't explain violence, but it can make it like worse, like a negative shock can like increase violence or make it last longer, but I wanted to think more about the role of inequality because I think it's like very correlated with especially criminal violence. So I think the way in which it fits in your framework, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, is first through recruitment, so, and it's very combined with this idea of like the ideology and the misperceptions. So when you have like this reserve army of labor that is like very poor and is very resentful and there's zero social mobility and they have access to crappy public goods, like what happens with those guys? Like they are very easy to recruit. They probably grow up in like households that have only one parent. They don't have any aspirations. They don't invest in human capital, and this probably also affects the costs, right? Because these criminal organizations are fundamentally unchecked, no? So they rip off a lot of, and I think a lot about like this old Levitt paper and the tournament structure of like this competition, like, or race to the top, where like most of the bottom or like the foot soldiers are going to die, or a lot of them are going to die or disappear, but they are attracted to like the status that brings or is associated to belonging to these criminal organizations and to the potential rewards, which is unlikely that they will get, right? So I don't know, you kind of offer like an answer to this, and maybe I shouldn't dwell on this a lot, and you say like, of course, more representative and more check societies will be more peaceful, like mechanically, but I was wondering if you thought that this is, I don't know, it's like narrowing the bargaining range in such a way that it makes it really hard. If we can solve the commitment problems between like cartels, will we see like a lasting peace if we still have like these like institutions that produce like a lot of exclusion? The other thing, and this borrows heavily from your co-author's work with Benjamin Lessing, I think I appreciate a lot that you are combining like these different forms of violence because they share a lot of characteristics, but we know that they are different in some ways, and they're fundamentally different in the sense that they're very embedded, and I think your work in Medellin really shows this, to what extent they are embedded in society. There's not a definite form of victory, and the structure of rents is very different. So I think this has implications not only in the sense that these groups will be more legitimate for like some citizens they like, quote, govern, but also because they have political influence, no? And they are embedded in like a larger network of political power that makes it hard to think through what are the incentives to eradicate them or to negotiate with them. But also because they don't disarm during like more peaceful moments, and because victory does not really change or lock in their preferred distribution of rent. So I wanted to talk about how these characteristics make some paths to peace like maybe more complicated or different, like especially thinking about enforcing, facilitating, and incentivizing, whether you think this can lead to like adverse selection or some type of issues. And this is the last slide, I promise. The trade-offs that I think you are very evident in your research for me are very important, and for me is the most interesting part of your work. So I like, Medellin is a beautiful city, and it used to be very violent, so I don't know, I felt happy like reading all these like examples of successful reaction of violence in Medellin. But one of the things you like accurately point out is like this brokered peace or these truces or these ceasefires actually allow like the embeddedness or these actors to entrench even more in the places they inhabit, no? So I wanted to know what you think about this trade-off, especially because it seems that these combos in the case of Medellin, but also like these local gangs in other contexts are not going to go away, right? But I don't know, maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I had like a strong feeling that like from the book and your work that mediation seems to be like the future of peace, and I agree with that a lot. So I wanted to know if we could talk a little bit about this, because how do we think about like an Oficina de Envigado in another place, right? If we look at the trend in the reduction of homicides in Medellin, it coincided with the mobilization of this bloque cacique Nutibana, and like this Berna forming the Oficina de Envigado. So is it more, you need a ceasefire and a strong state to broker the peace, and then you need an enforcer who belongs to that criminal world to maintain the peace or to make the commitment credible? And how would that look in a context like Mexico, no? Where the cartels are so big, it's hard to think about what a mediator looks in this context. No, should we start at the local level? Should we start, I don't know, talking to these criminal actors? But that's all. I really, really enjoyed reading the book. So.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity to read this book. I agree with Antonella on everything good she said about the book. I already told Chris before this event started that this is the first book I've read in many, many years. So I'm very happy to say that it is a fantastic book, because it would have been a pity to waste time on reading a bad book. You've already heard from Chris what's the main message of the book. I think the main message is very positive to all people who have tendency to fatalistic thinking, such as myself. Conflicts are the exception. When you think about it, whether there's going to be conflict or peace, the most credible prediction would always be that there's going to be peace. But sometimes conflicts do happen, and when they do, we have this very nice set of 5 reasons or 5 labels under which whatever reason for conflict you might have, you can always find a label among these 5 things. Unchecked interests, intangible incentives, uncertainty, commitment problems, overconfidence. Now, even if conflict happens, there's many ways that societies, even if there's competition, can live peacefully. So since I'm not a conflict scholar, I thought that I would use my very minimal knowledge about conflict and try to put the lessons from this book in a context that I know a bit better. So the book is very rich in examples. It's illustrating these things very nicely with stories from gangs of Medellin, historical conflicts, and so on. So maybe what I'm going to tell you about is not going to be as exciting as the examples in the book, but I think it matches the main message of the book very nicely. And Antonella and I didn't coordinate what we were going to say, but I think there's going to be some connection points between the things I'm going to say and the things that she just told you. So I'm going to take you to Finland. We're going to do a 70-year-long journey in Finnish history.
I was going to do the whole book around Finland, and then they
That's
persuaded
okay. You
me not to.
can take everything from these slides, and you're going to get Finnish History 101. This is all you need to know. We're going to start from 1868 to 1866 to 1868, and what happened back then. Okay, I'm going to tell you what happened, and maybe, do you have the original version of the slides? Okay, I'm going to tell you what happened. 1866, the weather conditions in Finland were terrible. So if you've ever been to Finland, you know that the weather is always bad, but 1866 to 1868, it was really, really bad. And Finland, still being an agricultural country at the time, of course, was hit with a very bad negative shock to agriculture. Now, this caused lots of crop failures, and eventually these crop failures led to a famine. 80% of the population died. Conditions were terrible. Now, if you think about this, you might imagine that people are very upset about what's going on. Lots of people have just died because of government failure to prepare for the situation or these kinds of things. But what happens instead? People don't have resources to fight. People blame divine intervention. So instead of having some kind of peasant revolt, you just continue living peacefully, even if you might have expected that there's going to be at least some sort of conflict. Do we have the? No. Okay, I'm going to tell you what happens next. This famine led to a spiral of events. Over the next 40 years or so, inequality started increasing drastically. And why was that the case? A lot of households were farming households, but during the famine, like, they didn't produce anything. They had to take debts, they had to use their farm as collateral. And in the end, because the famine went on and on, they could not pay back their debts. Their farms were taken away, they were foreclosed, and ownership of land, ownership of farms became more and more concentrated. So over time, there started to emerge these elites that owned more and more of the land. And since it was an agricultural country at the time, this land inequality meant also massive economic inequality. I want to wait until we have the slides because I have a couple of nice quotes from people who are important in the history. But if it doesn't work, then I'm going to continue with this story without the slides. Okay, I think we're going to have the slides now. Okay, perfect, thank you. So here I have there we go. Here I have a painting of the famine. Lots of people died, but we're here now. This is a quote from one of the leading figures in the workers' movement in Finland, Edward Gylling, describing what was happening to his land ownership and so on. He's got a quite nice mustache, so I'm certain there's at least one person in this room who tried this during the pandemic. Not saying it was me, but anyway. Now, there wasn't just economic inequality. Political institutions at the time were extremely exclusive. Economic inequality also meant political inequality. Why is that? It was because the amount of taxes you paid was tied to the number of votes you would have in municipal elections. Even if national elections already had universal and equal suffrage, local elections where you would decide about many important things like how to take care of unemployment, primary healthcare, primary education, these kinds of things. Power was concentrated to a very small elite. So here I have a quote from former Finnish president Urho Kekkonen. We're actually related. I don't know if you can tell it from the resemblance, but he describes how many members of the working classes, even middle classes, were completely excluded from politics. They had no way of influencing what was going to happen. Now, things are kind of bad, but still people don't fight. You would see in this graph on the left-hand side of the slide that in places hit harder by the famine, economic inequality was higher. So in the early 1900s, like, you might be asking, why am I talking about Finland? I think there's some interesting connection points with Latin America, even Latin American countries today. Finland was one of the most unequal countries in the West, and it was about as unequal as many Latin American countries, African countries today. Now, people didn't fight. They expressed their opinions in more peaceful ways. They voted in national elections for the opposition parties, in particular for the Social Democrats. They joined workers' associations. Occasionally they went on strikes, but these strikes were mostly peaceful and they didn't break into any larger fights. So if we look at Finland in the 1900s, things were not well, but there was, as historian Anthony Upton says, there wasn't anything inherent in the pre-World War I Finnish society that made a revolution necessary or even probable. Now, Finland was still part of Russia at the time. Maybe it was partially because every time something bad was happening, Russian elites could promise some concessions and keep people happy. But then something happens on the Russian side of the border. 1917, Russian Revolution starts, and it eventually causes some disturbances in Finland as well. So in December 1917, the Finnish Senate decides to declare independence of the Russian Empire, where the Tsar Nicholas II was just dethroned. And it happens completely peacefully. They just say, we're going to be independent now, thank you, bye. But the Russian Revolution had already started causing some turbulence also on the Finnish side of the border. And only a month after the declaration of independence, things start getting a bit more violent in Finland. As Finland became independent of Russia, this left kind of a power vacuum in the country. First of all, before the World War I, Russian government had backed the Finnish police forces, but they were dissolved. This was bad, because somebody wanted to fill that power vacuum. The workers' associations, different kinds of labor organizations, started creating their own municipal militias. They started arming them. And at the same time, the right-wing groups realized that there's more and more strike activity. We need to do something about this. And they started arming their own local militias. Now, people were demanding reforms that would tackle these social inequalities. They wanted lower or limitations to daily working hours. They wanted more equal land distribution. They wanted more equal voting rights, for example. Now, maybe the government would have been willing to do that if they knew that there would be a conflict if they wouldn't do it. But the government was very weak, and it was unclear whether they would be able to commit to providing these reforms. Now, eventually these little local skirmishes turned into full-blown conflict between the Reds, who were led by the section of the Social Democratic Party, and the Whites, who were the government side of the conflict. Now, what happened in the conflict? It ended up being one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. About 39,000 casualties, most of them insurgents. And insurgent participation was higher in municipalities that were earlier hit by the famine, that had more unequal conditions. But while we would think that maybe these inequalities are driving insurgency participation, perhaps it's unlikely that the inequality alone would have been enough to push Finland in the civil war. So it was likely some kind of interaction of these internal factors and external factors. So internally, you would have these underlying inequalities in the society, but externally, you have the Russian Revolution. Finnish socialists see that on the Russian side of the border, there is a successful revolution going on. Maybe they got a bit overconfident, who knows, especially because some of the leading figures of the Russian Revolution came to Finland and tried to encourage their Finnish comrades to race against the governing elites and try to bring the country to a socialist revolution. So I think these explanations that we might have quite nicely map into what you say in the book. Like, there's rarely just one explanation for war, and here we would have maybe the inequalities, we would have some ideological components, maybe some uncertainty, overconfidence, and so on. And let me use a couple more minutes to say about Finland's path to peace, and then we'll go on to discuss more exciting things than Finnish history. Now, the Finnish Civil War ended just a few months after it started, with the government side winning. And it was an extremely costly war to both sides, but in particular to the Reds. Most of the casualties were Reds, and it was also politically very costly to them. So after the Civil War, their popularity declined drastically, and this is actually something that the leading figures of the Social Democratic Party were really worried about. They did not want to have a revolution. They didn't want to have the human casualties. They didn't want to have the potential political harm. Now, despite this loss of the insurgents, they kind of got everything they wanted. They got labor reforms, they got the land reform, they got reforms to the municipal franchise. And this was something that elites saw as very important to keep peace. So this is kind of the checks and balances story that you have in the latter part of the book. Now, ever since the Civil War of 1918, Finland has remained relatively peacefully, except for some external threats during the Second World War, which actually may be playing part of the reason, or maybe one of the reasons why Finland has remained so united ever since. So you talk about interdependency in the latter part of the book, how to keep peace. So in a sense, it may be that these left-wing groups, right-wing groups, they realize that they shouldn't be enemies with each other, but there's a worse enemy potentially outside of the country. And we have something called the spirit of the Winter War, which is just a phrase to describe this unity that these two battling sides of the society eventually reached during the Second World War. So these are my remarks how to connect this book to something I know about. This is Matteo, who enjoyed the book almost as much as I did, but his favorite part was the cover. He ate the part.
Maybe I'll say two brief things, and then I'd like to have time for questions. So one relates to inequality, and one relates to, say, why we fight cartel wars. Peace doesn't have to be just or equal, and it seldom is. So that, and so there's often a trade-off with peace. Russians are subjugated by Putin, and they have not risen up. So there's peace. It doesn't make sense to fight, right? Almost every peasant in every society lorded over by feudal elites, and every citizen lorded over by a dictator, right? More years than not, they don't revolt, right? And in fact, they seldom revolt, because that civil war, that revolution, that insurgency would be too costly, right? Now, of course, sometimes they do, right? I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight, right? But I do want us to start off like a doctor who sort of starts off recognizing that the normal state of humanity is health, and then sickness is a deviation, right? I think we have to start out the same way. And the reason unequal societies don't revolt is because it's horrendously costly. Now, that said, I think they're more fragile, but and I think what you say, which is that it's easier to mobilize people, that just says war is cheaper, right? And so if war is cheaper, then maybe we're more likely to do it, and I think that's true. But I think what's more true is that societies that are economically unequal are typically politically unequal, because you get your rights by being able to demand them with your mobilizational and your material power. And if you don't have material power, then you probably don't have as much political power. And in unequal societies, you have unaccountable elites who are too ready to use violence. They're too ready to repress. They're too ready to do this thing that normally would be too ruinous to contemplate. So I think it's more about the political imbalance that makes it fragile. And then secondly, to get back to these intangible ideals and the intangible incentives to fight, I gave you a very ignoble one. I talked about Putin and Russia's desire for greater glory. Right? Whether that's true or not, that's a narrative that says there's an intangible incentive why we fight. But there are nobler intangible incentives why we fight, which is to say that some compromises are repugnant, and that accepting an unjust deal is sometimes people are willing to fight. And that is the history, in some sense, of every liberation movement. It's an ideological commitment to a particular division of power that people will fight unless they they obtain that. And that is the story actually of Ukraine's fight, and that is the story of the American Revolution, and it's the story of most anti-colonial movements in history. And so I see this more as about unchecked power and about ideological commitments to what is just, and the tension between justice and peace, and that to me is why societies that aren't equal are more likely to go to war. Then we get to the case of cartel wars and drug wars, and I'm new to Mexico, so I'm starting projects here, so I hope in a few years I'm more knowledgeable, but so a little bit of knowledge is dangerous, but I'll tell you my first impression, which is that many times we don't fight with cartels. In Medellin, there's peace, right? There's an uneasy truce. In Envigado and Bello, to the south and north, the municipalidades to the south and north of Medellin, there's been a long time political co-optation of the government. That was the story, to some degree, of Mexico under the PRI, was a corrupt deal, right? And that's the sensible deal on some level, right? Now, we may find that repugnant and reject it, but we're going to get to why we fight in a second. Most of the time, we don't. And so there's a strong incentive, because war is so costly, to simply cut a deal with the cartels. And they're strong. And like the warlords throughout history, we give them political power because they have material power. So why don't we do that? Well, obviously sometimes our governments have. They tend not to in democracies. And so I find it, my hypothesis is that it's hard to separate the democratization of Mexico and the unwillingness to tolerate these deals and the fight, and the democracy that exists in Colombia, and the fact that there's been an unwillingness to make these kinds of compromises. Because sort of like unjust compromises, some compromises are repugnant. And I think there's a popular unwillingness in the United States, or potentially in Mexico, and I think certainly in Colombia, to make these what we would call corrupt deals, but what would be peaceful deals with these powerful actors. Likewise, I think there's an ideological commitment, a repugnance that prevents these societies from legalizing these substances, and thus creating these markets and these powerful actors. Now, I think there's potentially strategic reasons not to make a deal, in the sense that they might get more powerful over time. That's actually a kind of commitment problem. There might be strategic reasons not to legalize these substances, because we would get more and more addicts over time, and this might be problem. So I think there's a certain strategic logic, but fundamentally I think there's an ideological commitment in many democracies not to legalize these substances and not to make corrupt deals, and therefore we fight. And I think we're doomed to that fight so long as we are committed to those ideals. Now, I happen to share at least one of those ideals, which is not to make the corrupt deals. I personally am more open to legalization, but I don't see a political consensus, certainly in my country. I don't see it in Colombia. It presumably isn't here. So that's my answer to why we fight.
Thank you to all of you. We still have time for some questions. Si se sienten más cómodos preguntando en español, podemos traducir sin ningún problema. Just raise your hand and Juan Pablo will give you the microphone too. Don't be shy. Well, I actually have one, Chris. Sorry. I've been thinking lately about how this. Well, we have a very, I think everyone tends to agree in that we usually assume that human nature, if we're assuming what human nature is that we tend to be violent, that we are selfish. Therefore, we need these institutions so that things don't get violent and we can solve our conflicts. But lately, for some reasons, I've been talking with theologists and philosophers, and they say, well, maybe that's not the case. I mean, that may be a very useful and analytical assumption, but some people doesn't think that way. Some people doesn't assume that we humans are violent or selfish and the like. That's like an outcome of living in a certain society. That's why we tend to behave like that. But that's not human nature. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, I agree. So you'll often hear that humans, or maybe out of one of a very small number of species, are the only ones to engage in large-scale warfare with one another. And the ones that do are very closely related to humans. And that's true, but I think if you talk to evolutionary biologists or anthropologists, what seems to be more true and more distinguishing about humans is our ability to cooperate. And so we have both, and I would argue that our ability to cooperate typically exceeds our ability to be aggressive. And I would say one aspect of that, which I think I talk a lot about in the Paths to Peace, is our ability as a society. I think human societies have been very successful over time at constructing identities and ideologies that actually entrench peace, right? The idea of human rights. Like, so what is the idea of us all being human beings and having equal rights, which is an invention of the past 300 years, really? It means that in this simple game, which leads us not to fight, I don't have to care about the cost of war to you. I don't fight because of the cost of war to me. War is costly to me. Care less what happens to your group. But if I start to have some ideology where I care about other human beings, and so the fact that my government bombs someone in Afghanistan or somewhere else in the world causes me pain, that now all of a sudden war is even more costly than it was before. And so I think, and we've been, some philosophers sort of call it our expanding circle, right? So our ability to think of the person on the other side of the village as a human being who's from a different religion or ethnic group makes us more peaceful, and our ability to think about somebody on the other side of the nation as a member of the same group makes us more peaceful, and now our ability to sort of conceive of ourselves as a species, I think, makes us more peaceful. And so that's it's not an inevitable trend, but I think it's a really, it's a really important one.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a political science student, and my question is, like, you're talking about these unjust costs when you make deals. So how can you measure if the unjust costs are more likely to be taken than the risk of war? Is the war always has the most costs, or are unjust costs also very high sometimes that they make people not want to make deals?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, it's in some sense, like, how do we, in the midst of so much inequality in the world, how do we know which inequalities are going to result in conflict? Attempts to predict conflict are, through machine learning tools, through, super forecasters and so forth, are horrendously difficult. I think it's precisely because the best prediction is always peace. And there's so many forces pushing towards war. And so I think we can understand which are the factors that make some societies more vulnerable. And then I think it's potentially a set of idiosyncratic events and idiosyncratic personalities and leaders that actually determine when that fighting actually happens, which is a really unsatisfying state of affairs. But I think that's actually fundamentally where we are. I mean, you look at the Ukrainian government, despite days before the Russian invasion, if you listen to Ukrainian government officials, military officials, saying they didn't believe it was going to happen, even with the US intelligence saying it was going to happen, they still thought, this isn't likely, this is a bluff. All right, and now somebody was right and somebody was wrong, as is always the case in this. So I think it's just fundamentally hard to do, and that's, I think I would sell more books if I had a better answer. I think if I was like, now we can predict war, and I think the harder truth that doesn't sell as many books but is more important for people to internalize this, I think this is one of the hardest and most difficult things.
Hi, my name is Carolina. I study economics, and my question is, like, is always peace desirable? Like, for example, when you were talking about the drug cartels, like, you say we don't fight them a lot, but like it's not, like there's a conflict but not war or fighting. So do you always wish for peace even though like with a fight you can eliminate that problem?
Well, I mean, I think that's for every person to decide. I'm mostly a pacifist, but not entirely. Like, I mean, think of it, I'm an immigrant to the United States from Canada. Would I have advised John Adams and George Washington to accept would I have advised them to reject this ideology of liberty and to accept this semi-sovereignty from a tyrannical superpower? Right? That's essentially the same thing that's happening today. Russia is a militarily stronger, economically infinitely more powerful tyranny that went to a democracy on its border and said, you're getting semi-sovereignty. Belarus accepted it, Kazakhstan accepted it, you accepted it. And that's what England did to the United States. It said, Canada took it, so did the other colonies. You're also going to accept semi-sovereignty and pay slightly higher taxes. This is a totally reasonable deal because we're more powerful. And for ideological reasons, they said no way. So I would like to think I would make the same choice. I would like to think I'd make the same choice if I were in Kenya in 1950 or Algeria in 1960 and so forth. But so I won't deny people that, right? So I think we should at least. So I just want us to understand peace and not to sort of treat it as some thing that we must do at all costs.
¿Más? Ok, Juan Pablo. Sí, para hablar se pueden quitar la mascarilla para que se escuche más claro.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Isaac. I'm a student of economics and political science. And my question is, I don't know if I understand it well from what you present, the three of you, but like I understand like violence or the use of war as a group decision. But what aspects of, because like many times or many examples in history also, I don't know, have like leaders that impulse these actions of use of violence. So what aspects of a leader or a certain person do you consider in your book to be important to be like a deterrent of war or the use of violence? Or is it just like a construct of a group and then that's where you use violence? Thank you.
Thanks. I guess I'd like to say there's no good or bad leaders. There's only checked and unchecked leaders, which is a slight exaggeration because I think there are personal traits and ideologies, and so there are good and bad leaders. But fundamentally, I think the difference between peaceful and violent societies are the ones where those leaders have their hands tied. So if Russia was still run by a Politburo, right, a council instead of a personal dictator, I think war would have been less likely. And if Russia were run by a party and by an oligarchy and a business elite and a military elite like it is in China, I think war would have been even less likely. And China's a good example of a reasonably checked autocrat, right? Not a democracy, not a fully checked autocrat, but I think it's a country that's been peaceful and I think so far has remained peaceful and may for a time remain peaceful because of these checks and balances. And then, of course, the best situation of all is, I think, is an even more checked leader, and not necessarily or only by elections, but by the division of power between the center and the regions, across branches of government, to judiciaries, and also at the supranational level, to signing treaties and being part of regional agreements and alliances. All of these things check the power of individuals. So to me, that's the number one determinant. It's much more interesting to read a history book about the individual personal characteristics and psychology of a leader, but to me that's secondary. It's about checked and unchecked. I think there are questions over here as well.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm Jorge Tello from the Center of Security Intelligence Studies here at ITAM. And thank you very much. And I'm going to make you a completely different question, but I think it's very important for us to learn how much do we have to do in the universities about this. Because there's one thing for sure, I have to read your book. I mean, I haven't, but I think we are thinking very little about this. And in Mexico, we have all these violence problems, minority problems, and it is my belief that we are doing so little about how we understand and how much we know what is going on. And I think it's not only Mexico, but it's around the world. And my question is for you, what is the reaction you have had to your work, to your book? Do you have any, what do the politicians think about, the government people, the people of the governments in different parts of the world? I don't know, for how long have you been presented the book, and have you been you have any chances to have any response? But my question is, how much can we actually influence and make a difference to understand what is going on? Because it seems to me sometimes that the civilization process hasn't brought us to a better world. And well, that's the question you are asking. That's what is on the field. That's the way humans are. It doesn't matter, I mean, technology, science, what we already are, now we are still fighting each other and killing each other. I don't know if you do to comment about that.
Yeah, thank you. So I struggled with that when I was writing the book because, look, most books die in the last chapter. And they die, I think, in a few ways. One is they try to say, okay, now I've explained war, now I've explained the paths to peace. Now let me give you the 10-step path to how we can, here's the simple thing we can all do to sort of achieve world peace. And we're marching forward, right? So the very Steven Pinker, optimistic, everything is getting better, and here's how. That's one way to end the book. The other way to end the book is to say it's hopeless, and we're just going down from here. And so, a development economist in the audience, William Easterly. Bill Easterly is a good friend of mine, and all of his books are like, can't do nothing, live with it. So I didn't want to end, I didn't believe either of those things, so I didn't want to end that way. And so I thought, well, what do I believe? And do I think that any individual diplomat or president or aid worker or government official can make a difference? And so actually I ended up teaching a class for 2 years that I call the class How to Save the World. But what it is it's like all the social science. I said, well, let's go read the political scientists and the economists and the sociologists and the anthropologists who have studied what made good and bad decisions and policies and whether individual choices can make any difference. And I think actually collectively, social science actually, there's a surprising unanimity to the answer. And it actually goes back to someone like Karl Popper, who talked about the piecemeal social engineer, right? So Karl Popper said, the way to fail is to make grand leaps, to have grand visions of what to do. World peace, the 10-step plan to peace, if we all do this, we will have it. He said that's almost always wrong, and it almost always fails. And he says, and the only reason that ever happens is because of unchecked, unaccountable power. All right, and that's another refrain throughout this story. It's not just that unchecked, unaccountable power leads to war, it actually leads to bad policy, because these unchecked elites make hugely bad choices. So what does like a piecemeal approach look like? If piecemeal approaches work in other realms, what would a piecemeal approach look like in conflict? And so I titled the last chapter Piecemeal Engineers, but I spelled it P-E-A-C-E, which is my dad joke. And it's a whole chapter, so I won't be able to explain it here, but I think the answers, there's a huge amount of evidence of small decisions on the margin leading to a more peaceful society. So let me when I go to the World Bank, for example, or if I go talk to the US government, the message I tell them, which they don't like to hear, but I think resonates, is like, the problem is the way you have designed the international system of aid and development and diplomacy, which is that you take a society where there's too much centralized power and you make it worse because you channel money and diplomatic power and sovereignty through not just the center, but often through an individual sovereign. And yet you make choices every day without thinking about it in diplomacy and aid about decentralizing power. So every time you have a community-driven development program and you drop millions of dollars out of helicopters instead of putting it through the finance ministry, you're decentralizing power. Every time you fund schools instead of an education ministry, you're decentralizing power. Every time you support microfinance and small business development and in an industrial sector, you're decentralizing economic power in that society, and so you actually can make a choice every day, and you can do that as a central government as well, right? You can entrench power, or you can decentralize it, and so they don't. I guess they don't mind this message because I can tell them that without thinking of it, half of the stuff they're doing is making it better, and half the stuff they're doing is making it worse, and they just need to think about this new criterion: is are we contributing to over-centralized power and bad policy and the risk of conflict, and let's just inject that into our decision making. So I think that's the kind of thing on the margin that anybody in any position in any government or diplomatic or aid agency could make that would actually have a huge difference.
Well, I haven't read the book also, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to ask you something about the book, but I have this question. Do you think the Mexican conflict right now between the cartels it's more similar to a civil war kind of conflict, or just like a huge nationwide gang fight type of conflict? That's question number one. And the second one could be related is, there's a popular argument right now in Mexico that the violence could be really related with poverty and inequality factors that increase violence, and once we solve that conditions, probably automatically we won't have any more violence. Against another argument that will be that basically we have a very weak police and judicial institutions, and that's why we have like a massive violence, because we can't have those strong institutions to hold that kind of a conflict. Those are the questions. How do you think about it?
So I don't want to say that institutional quality and poverty are unimportant. I think they're a distraction from the true causes. I think most poor places don't fight. Most places with poor functioning institutions don't fight. And so I guess we should just be cautious about that as a cause. Now, I actually think well-functioning institutions of dispute resolution actually are hugely important at reducing the risk. So I think, because fundamentally they don't fight because war is too costly and the violence is too costly. Nonetheless, the inability to sort of have village level, regional level, national level mechanisms of dispute resolution that actually can use peaceful means, not violence means, are hugely important to sort of creating that buffer against violence. So I think they're very important. But I think the poverty aspect, listen, I spent a lot of my career fighting against poverty. There's lots of reasons to reduce poverty. I don't think less violence is necessarily going to be the case, right? The fact is the war's costly, poor society, whether the pie is big or the pie is small, war is always costly, and so we should focus on why sides would ignore those costs, not whether the pie is big or small. In terms of like, is Mexico different from civil wars? I think it depends on the nature of the civil war. I spent a lot of my career working in Liberia, which you have a bunch of gangster-like warlords with unchecked power pursuing their own private material interests in the form of war economies. And so that looks a great deal like I think, you know, much more, this is a set, I think one of the fundamental problems in society there was just the fact that power is so concentrated that a set of small number of individuals could pursue private interests through warfare and try to enrich themselves, all trying to capture a highly centralized presidency. What strikes me as different about Mexico and the cartel conflict, what strikes me as important about this, and I think it's also, it's sort of like the 2 or 301 level, this isn't in the book really. All of the incentives, these natural incentives for peace, essentially the game theory that makes a peaceful bargain efficient, starts to break down when you have 3, 4, 5, 6 enactors, all right? It's suddenly like you get into a situation of multiple equilibria where it's actually very hard to have a stable peace deal. So if you look at Eastern Congo or you look at Liberia where there's dozens and dozens of rebel groups, it's very hard to maintain an equilibrium. When mediators go into a conflict that look like that, the very first thing they do is they try to form those groups into 2 coalitions because it's much easier to create a bargain in 2 stable coalitions than it is with even 3 or 4 or 8. Medellin, I think, has been successful in its peace because the criminal organizations have formed into 2 coalitions, which is different from the past, right? And so I think there's an element of just how stable is your bargaining when there's multiple actors. And so I think there's an added element which isn't in the book and I think is important to think about. It's the fact that you have all of these different cartels that makes a stable bargain between any 2 of them or between one of them and the government very hard to maintain. And so I would start to think about actually, I mean, I think peace might mean trying to find a more stable equilibrium would look like something where you have a smaller number of larger cartels that are able to bargain with one another. And I think evolutionarily over time, and it might take decades, that's probably what would emerge as it's emerged in Medellin.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I had a question because you mentioned this idea of like a repugnant bargain in order to achieve peace in the long run. And that reminds me of the concept of bearing the hatchet, right? Of being in the midst of a conflict and deciding to stop for just in long-term thinking because it's becoming too costly. But one of the reasons people groups and the parties of some conflicts choose not to pursue this action is because of the desire for vengeance, or in other words, in their perception, the desire to achieve justice. So if these repugnant bargains, right, if bearing the hatchet is like the easiest path for peace, is there no space for another resolution which would satisfy this desire for justice to be done? Is it really such a pessimistic outlook? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really perceptive. So my second broad cause of war I was saying were like these intangible incentives and these ideological incentives where the act of violence is actually valued in itself, or what you value is only something that violence can deliver. And so you're aware of the costs of war, but you're willing to pay it. And I talked about glory as one. I talked about fair distribution and rejection of an unfair distribution as another. And you raise a third, I think really crucial one, which is vengeance. And I think this is incredibly important in understanding a lot of long-running ethnic and religious conflicts. In the book, I talk about Northern Ireland, for example, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily lead to a war to break out, but if a war breaks out for other reasons, right? Maybe it's the uncertainty of the situation leads to skirmishing and a short fight, which should be over quickly. The uncertainty that led to that fight evaporates within months, if not faster. But then why do wars go on? Why do some wars go on for years? And I think it's because sometimes those initial actions lead to outrage and a desire for vengeance. And in the book, I use the example of Northern Ireland. And so I think it's a hugely important factor in why some wars persist, rather than why they break out. And then in terms of how do you overcome that, I mean, a major role of, again, mediators and external actors in a conflict is to actually try to persuade, and this is true of violence interrupters on the streets of Chicago, mediators of gang conflicts who I've been meeting this week with in Monterrey, or mediators like Jonathan Powell in Northern Ireland. They have to try to persuade people to sort of look at the cost of war and compare that to the payoff from vengeance, and maybe to seek some alternative means of restorative justice. But that's really hard. I think it only happens when both sides, once that cycle begins, I think that peace often only happens when they've exhausted themselves so much that the vengeance has almost died out and they just don't have any strength to continue anymore. So I think it's a really important sad driver.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I'm thinking more from a sociological perspective, and some organizations' identities are based on violence, and therefore personal identities, like violence shapes personal identities. So, and maybe this identity in which violence is important can be an incentive to engage in violent activities. No? So I would like to know what are your thoughts on this kind of group identity leading to violence, and how to lead these people to a path to peace.
Yeah, so, a lot of my work in the last few years has been, for example, in Chicago, working with gangs where there's a socialization into violence. That's partly just a function of the environment, but like many armed groups, and I include a national military or a guerrilla organization, sometimes leaders have an incentive to socialize their groups into violence because it serves their purposes. And I would say that two things. One is that to the extent that this happens, I think of it as, yes, driven sometimes by these sort of violent, chaotic environments, but I often think of it as being driven by these unchecked leaders who have an interest in mobilizing people. It's expensive to pay soldiers, whether that's a gang soldier, right? It's really expensive. Much better if you can if you can socialize people into doing this for ideological or other reasons, right? It's cheap. Ideology is cheap. And so I think that sustaining violence is often the product of unchecked leaders who have an interest in fighting, whether that's a gang leader or a dictator or even a minister of defense. Because the thing that's very tangible, like you talk to some of these young men, and yes, they've been socialized into violence, but they are also aware, they're very acutely aware, like every minute of every day they live in fear, and they're miserable. And they might not realize it when they're 17, which is one reason guerrilla groups, gangs, the US military loves to recruit people before they're 18 or 19, right? Before our brains have developed enough to sort of recognize just how escapable this actually is. And so almost always, to a surprising degree, when you give a lot of people a path out, they'll take it, at least once they're in their 20s. And so I think it's like hopeful, because I think people are, yes, they've been socialized into violence, but I think they're just miserable, and most of them are acutely aware of that.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Majo. I'm a political science and international relations student. And you were just mentioning something about young men being part of, like, in the root of the conflict. And I was wondering if the book, I haven't read it obviously, but if the book sort of mentions anything about how, is it gender biased, the roots of war? Like if we can actually talk specifically about something that, because I know there's a lot of feminist studies that do mention that war tends to be masculine, but I was wondering if you, in the book, mentioned that, or if you have any sort of opinions about that.
Sure. No, I do. I mean, it's suspicious, right? Most generals are men, most gang members are men, most soldiers are men, most killers are men in most societies. So there's something, especially when it comes to interpersonal violence, there's something that's likely a mix of biology and socialization that makes a lot of interpersonal violence male. I think when you get, though, to the level of groups, I think it's different. So I think gender matters, but not in the way that people usually think. A lot of people think that this individual aggression aggregates into group aggression. And I think that's actually not generally true. Of course, it's true a little bit. But actually, groups deliberate, groups think. And a lot of that individual male aggression is a lot more reactive and hot and short term. So it tends to filter out, I think, in groups. To me, it goes back to this whole point about the lack of accountability or unchecked leaders. A society only represented by men, where only men have a say, is one where half of the people are excluded, and thus their interests in peace and the costs they bear are imperfectly considered, right, at most. And so any exclusion of women from the political process, I think, is violent, or because it leads to this problem of an unchecked elite who are able to ignore, it accentuates this problem of being too ready to use violence. And that's why I think a more inclusive, so the thing that I think the reason that more inclusive societies matter, I think it's pacifying. It's not because women are more innately pacific than men, because once they become presidents, they are often not, right? Women and male leaders are almost equally likely to go to war in history. Women leaders may be even more likely to go to war. Look, you know, Nancy Pelosi has just ignited this conflagration, right? So whatever truth there might be there, like, it's swamped out, I think, by this issue of just broader representation.
And if you want to say something else, Antonella, Jakko, Chris, before we close the session? Nothing? Okay. Well, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks so much, Antonella and Jakko, for commenting on this. It's been a very insightful session. I'm sure many will read the book now that they know what's about and that they have heard from you. So thank you, for all of you as well, for being here, and see you soon in the next session.
Thank you for having me.